One time in Centralville, around the turn of the beginning of the last century, this was a heavily Franco-American community. Jack lived in 5 different homes here in Centralville. Two of the most important of which happen to be his birthplace at 7-9, and then we're going to go over there once we get through with the church and the school, end of this tour. To 34 Burleigh Street, where his brother died when Jack was 4 years of age. Centralville is quite a wonderfully mixed community. This at one time was part of Dracut, and it got annexed by the city back in 1854. Jack always considered like the little Canada, which is basically, I'd say about 95% gone, sort of like a slummish area and so on. But it truly really wasn't, because it got torn down around 1964 thanks to, in one part, to a banker who had a lot of property there. I won't mention his name, but he was the president of the Union National Bank for years. And unfortunately, they tore a lot of it down. And that was the so-called urban renewal phase that was going on all over the country. And the real change came here in Lowell around I think it was around 1959. They demolished one of these big boarding houses on Dutton Street, which is right across the Merrimack Canal from where Lowell High School is. And people started saying, you know, we're kind of leveling everything here. And one of the reasons, a lot of these mill buildings, I'm still doing that thing with the National Park. They claim it's about 25% of the mill structures still standing. It's about 40%. And I'm getting all the old maps and so on, and I'm not counting the boarding houses. Many of those were torn down. The city was too poor to demolish those things. And back in those days, there was no such thing as federal estate money coming in to pave the way. And a number of them actually were being used by smaller firms. In fact, Jack's dad had his little print shop in that massive Massachusetts mill complex. When we were at the commemorative this morning, all those mill buildings in the back, those are the Massachusetts mills. And they were probably about 8 other structures that belonged to that corporation that got demolished. And one was that massive warehouse that was there, and it was massive. They had to be big because they were storing a lot of the cotton, especially the onset of the Civil War. Many up here thought the Civil War wouldn't last too long. It was actually called the War of the Rebellion. And so what these mill owners did, they packed these houses, these warehouses full of cotton for the few months or so that the war might take place. Well, we all know that didn't exactly happen and so on. When that was demolished, that was a major undertaking to have this building down. So literally where the commemorative is, that's where that warehouse was. And then those days too, in the Roman Catholic perspective, where you lived is where you went to church. And if there was a school, you went to that school. In my area of the city of Lowell, it's called Back Central. There were streets that were divided. One half of one street to say you belong to St. Peter's Church, you're on this side, you're at Sacred Heart Church. And that was it. You didn't fool around with those things back in those days. We understand the mentality of how central these churches were in these schools and life of the Catholic community. And one of the reasons why the Catholic Church built so many of these schools, so there was a great deal of bigotry and bias against Roman Catholics, especially the Irish. In the 19th century, when they're coming over because of the famine in Ireland and so forth, and the church said, "Well, we're gonna build our own schools, and we'll be able to teach our faith in those schools and so on." And it became a massive undertaking. But you were kind of almost required by then, by the local pastors, to say you've got to send your kid to the local parish school, Catholic school, and that was all there was to it. And so I'll mention more about that when we go over the school itself. So Suzanne, take it away.
Okay, this along with 4 or 5 other parishes in the city was closed by the Archdiocese in 2004. And as the aftermath of that, the Massachusetts Historical Commission did a survey of the whole St. Louis de France complex, hoping to have it set aside as a historical district. And so people contributed to substantiating the argument for having it declared a historical district. I'm not sure whatever happened to that. It was recommended that it be declared that, but it seems never to have actually been done. So that is like a bit of, a murky area, but this is the historical narrative that was put together as a part of the survey. And it's very illustrative, of all the essential things we're going to be talking about today. By the turn of the century, the Franco-American population of Lowell had grown substantial enough to have established enclaves on both sides of the Merrimack River. For the most part, these families gathered for Mass and the sacraments at St. Joseph's Parish, which was right downtown across from what is the Lowell High School building. However, crossing the river to attend Mass had become a hardship for the residents of the Centralville section of Lowell, and they were eager to worship in their own neighborhood. In 1903, the Centralville Catholics received permission from the Archdiocese of Boston to begin a movement for a parish of their own. Mr. John, that's interesting, not Jean, Mr. John Bollier and Mr. Jacques Boisvert, those are the two streets we're going to be walking around, bought a parcel of land and then donated a 20,000 square foot section of that land to the Archdiocese as a site for the new parish. So these two guys were not poor mill workers. They had enough money to buy a huge parcel of land. And then I suspect they probably built some of the little houses on Bollier and Boisvert streets. The Archdiocese soon assigned Reverend J.N. Jacques, or Jakes, as pastor to the fledgling parish. Over the next 9 years, Reverend Jakes led St. Louis de France on an ambitious building program. And they did not start with the full-blown church. They started with schools. In early 1904, Father Jakes supervised the construction of a temporary chapel, the small wooden St. Louis Hall, on the corner, one of these corners, of West 6th and Boisvert streets. He also bought the rectory. I don't know what it was being used for, but he bought the rectory, and in 1905, land which would become the sites for the St. Louis de France School, St. Louis de France Convent, and Parish Hall. So up that street are the original school and convent. With the construction and opening of St. Louis de France School in 1907, and you'll see the date, 1907, over the doorway of the school when we get up there. He saw the goal of constructing education facilities through to its completion. Before he could undertake a new church, Father Jakes died accidentally at the age of 50 in 1913. His successor, Reverend Labossiere, and it's very interesting. If you flip over to the other side, there's a little passage from Visions of Gerard where Kerouac refers to Father Père La Lumière. So I wonder if that's one of those fictionalized names. He changed La Boissière to La Lumière.
Absolutely.
Yes, anyway. Okay. So, La Boissière also pursued a vigorous building program. In 1914, he bought land adjoining the St. Louis de France Rectory. And in 1917, he started construction of a new church. The basement level was completed and in use in less than a year, but the upper part remained unbuilt for many years. So if you turn over again, and those of you who were just over at Kerouac Park heard Kerouac describing the church as a basement affair, because essentially the basement was built and an upper part was not built until years later. And you can see this photo of the capstone. AD 1916, that's when the basement was begun. Then the upper church was only started in 1954. So, you know, the parish had other priorities, and then there was the Depression, not enough money, et cetera, et cetera.
And I don't know, folks, I don't mean to interrupt, if you want to see this, it's hard to see it on the tablet screen, but literally, this entire part where the mosaic is not there, okay? And this is how the church looked in Kerouac's day, when Father Lavoisier did masses here, and this is what the church looked like on the day Gerard Kerouac's funeral was held.
It
Okay.
doesn't look like a basement church then.
Well, it's kind of almost the illusion a little bit. If you look, it's set a little bit below the ground, and when you walk in, the ground level is right down here. So it's almost kind of between floors somehow. But
Yeah, if you look at this photo when we go over that side, here's the upper church, and there's what was the basement. You can distinctly see the two different levels.
Well, the ends of each section here, that's about as high as the basement church was. There's another church in my neighborhood. It was very large and still is a Portuguese community called St. Anthony's Church, which is still open. And that was a basement church. And it just rose above the ground, maybe about 10 or 12 feet. And then as time went by, well, then they added on to it. Very similar, not quite as high as this church here. So those are the only two churches I know of. So one time...
Jeanne d'Arc. That was a basement.
That's right, Jeanne d'Arc was.
St. Jeanne d'Arc was a basement
There were,
church.
I think there were 14 parishes here in the city back, I know, in the 1950s.
And six
those
of them
are the
were
three.
French.
Yeah.
Okay. Bill.
Well, shall we talk? We're going to talk about, well, your baptism took place here almost immediately, because back in those days too, there was this awful fear that somehow if an unbaptized child died, then they can't get into heaven. This is why the Roman Catholic Church invented limbo. It was sort of like Candyland for kids who don't get to heaven. That has been completely taken off now.
Were they called Holy Innocents?
The Holy Innocents. In fact, there's a section up in St. Patrick's Cemetery, and it's a lot, and it has the Holy Innocents. So they figure, well, they certainly don't go to hell. They don't go to purgatory. They can't get into heaven, so they had limbo and so on. So families would almost as soon as they were born would have the babies baptized. And again, there was a lot of illness that went around 2 years and years ago. But usually when they were a few months old, then they would have the ceremony in the church to help them be baptized there. And of course the confessions took place here. This is where that wonderful, beautiful passage that was already read, the commemorative about Gerard confessing that he hurt some boy's heart. That's amazing stuff. Whether or not that actually happened or not, the dream thing that we're going to talk about, that Gerard, about the Virgin Mary, that apparently is true. I don't want to tell too much how I should say know that, but that's not a made-up story apparently. Thanks to Roger Bernal and his research. So they would you go to confession, and you know, if you, I mean, what kind of sins can you commit? You make your first Holy Communion usually at age 7, and you'd have to go to confession first. And I remember because I went to a St. Peter's Catholic school, and we'd be herded off to confession once a week and so on. But prior to the big first confession and so on, you say, well, what kind of terrible deeds can a 7-year-old kid do? You know, just because there was this thing in the church about mortal sin, which was, and if you didn't go to church on the Sunday back then, that was called a mortal sin. That was equated with if you went and you shot 16 people in cold blood, those are mortal sins, you go to hell. If you miss Mass on purpose, that's a mortal sin, and you go to hell too. It's just just kind of an amazing, scary thing. And venial sins were the little lies, like I told a little lie, something like that. And I can remember in the old Baltimore catechisms, I still have an original copy of that.
I do too.
They portrayed this with the milk bottle.
Yes.
The milk bottles, yes.
And
yes,
the
yes.
little venial sins, the milk bottle would have some black splotches on it. If it was a mortal sin, the milk turned chocolate. It was all black. I mean, this sounds ludicrous nowadays, but that was serious business back there. So, and half the time, I remember, you know, we'd have to go up, troop up to the church, and then we had Sisters of Charity of Halifax, and they were wonderful, kind women. They weren't beating kids up. They weren't cracking their knuckles and stuff. I mean, sometimes you hear these stories and say, what they were all sadists or something. That's not in my case. So. You'd probably, I used to remember I would actually get into a fight with somebody on the way up to church so I could confess that I just had a fight with somebody. And we had
load up on your sin first.
No. And then there was one guy that we all dreaded. His name was Father Mullen. And I was an altar boy, and then you had to learn Latin back in those days to be an altar boy. The response, the suscipiat, the confidior, and back in those days too, Mass, the priests weren't facing people, and Vatican II changed a lot of that. And they would raise the host so people could see the large host. And the words were like, hic est anum corpus meum. While I'm kneeling there, I would repeat the same words. And this Father Mullen stopped, turned around, and he took me right out and said, you shouldn't be saying those words because those are the words of consecration, that transubstantiation, whatever you want to call that, where the bread becomes the body and blood of Christ and the wine and so forth. It was amazing. But Father Mullen was kind of hard of hearing. And you would dread going to confession to him because you'd be kneeling there, the door opens, you'd confess, he'd say, you did what? You know, and all your classmates are out there. How many times did you do that? And you say, oh my God, you come out. Actually, a lot of us come out, we were kind of proud of it, saying, yes, this is what's going on. But that was whether you were in a French parish or my background, my father's side Irish, my other side is Polish. No matter it was Irish, Polish, the Orthodox Greek and so forth, and the French Canadian, it was all the same experience for us. The only difference being that when I went to church, the Mass was in Latin. I'd go with my mother to Holy Trinity Polish Church, which is still open, and the Mass there was said in Polish. I'd sometimes go to Lithuanian church, and that was in Lithuanian. Then I'd go to sometimes to St. Anthony's, and it was in Portuguese. I remember saying to my pastor, this guy named Father Monsignor Twist, why can't we hear the Mass in our language, in English? And he said, we want to take care of all the immigrants. That was the response. But again, this is why when you talk about the confession and the priest hearing Gerard saying, I heard the boy's heart saying, wow, this is something else, and so on. That was serious business, and so was receiving the Holy Communion. The wonderful thing, though, about confession, And it's also in the Visions of Gerard, and it was read through at the commemorative, that the feeling of relief that you felt coming out, I have been cleansed of my sins, I'm starting all anew. And I remember next door neighbor, they were Baptists, and they said, well, how can you possibly do that if you just do the same thing over and over? I said, we had this thing called the intention not to sin again. So you'd say your act of contrition, and you would have to say, hope, and say, I kind of promise I won't get into a fight, I won't swear, and all this kind of stuff. Otherwise, the confession's not valid. So you'd leave and say, I firmly hope not to do this, but you probably would do it again anyway, but not on purpose. So I try to explain, say, no, that wasn't what it's all about. But it was a tremendous, it felt like you were being reborn again spiritually. It was a great kind of a sense of closeness that I felt with that. And then, you know, you never go back again the next week for the same old thing, maybe 40 times. Okay, that's enough of that movie. Sorry. I just want to give a background about what the Roman Catholic kind of experience would be for a lot of the family.
Can I just add one thing? To add to Bill's point about baptism, Gerard Kerouac was born on August 23rd, 1916. He was baptized the next day. Jack Kerouac was born in March. He was baptized on the 19th, which was exactly a week after he was born. So they tried to get those baptisms in pretty quickly. And when you think about it, I don't know that anyone had a sense that Gerard Kerouac was ill, you know, the moment he was born into the world. But the truth is, that's a pretty quick turnaround. It's like, how frail must he have been as a child? By the way, his baptism happened over the other side of the river at St. John Baptiste. But Jack's happened here.
Jack's was there.
Gerard's funeral was held here. Jack's funeral was held on the other side of the river, so they kind of played flip-flop with the two of them. But yeah, getting those baptisms quickly, very important. In fact, I was baptized Catholic, and mine was like 2 days.
I think mine was about a week.
They must have wheeled the priest in there or something, you know, right into, you know, the room where you're sitting in the little bassinets or whatever. I was like,
oh,
how could I have been ready for that yet?
You didn't have much of a choice. And the fact that Jack's funeral was in St. John Baptiste just underscores that it was sort of a break from tradition, because they never lived in that parish. But Stella wanted that mass there because that was the big cathedral church of the Franco-American community. This is why when he went in the 5th grade at St. Joseph's School, he couldn't continue because they did not live in the parish. He skipped the 6th grade totally, and then went up to Bible school in the 7th grade. But that was an exception.
And also, she would have been aware of his bond with Father Spike.
Oh, sure.
And Father Spike was stationed at that church.
The best hairpiece money can buy. Oh, that must be from the play area.
Yeah. One of the readings we had at the commemorative too, they talked about Gerard getting up. They just live right a block over there. Just walking over to school and so forth in the morning, and they had the yard. You wait until the school bell rang, you come in, and so on. I will read the passage about the division, because I think that's an important thing, an event in Jack's life about his brother having had this vision. You can see it's French. It calls St. Louis, and when they went to school here, back in those days, you went home for lunch. So they would come to school in the morning, and all the classes were in French. Go home for lunch, come back, and the classes were in English. And when Roger Brunel was doing this, we were able to actually get inside here. This school just closed, I think 3 years ago now, 4. And it was quite a thing to go in there. And you know, because the school, the children were, we do this on a day like this, so the kids were in the school, but they had all the little desks there with the names on them, and back in those days too, they had the American flag, the Vatican flag, and there was also, and you know this, the French-Canadian flag. That's not the French flag. There's a representation of that in front of Lowell City Hall. So what I want to do, just read that passage. Could you hold that for me for
Sure.
if I can find this, because this is oh yeah, this is the Gerard's in the this is the classroom, and I know that because Roger Grinnell said so. Because he, well, I want to read this, and I'll say how Roger kind of knew that, because we were in that room somehow. So Gerard is apparently nodding off, and the nun comes over, I think she's called Sister Marie, and kind of prods him, and he talks about, he had this vision of the Virgin Mary. It's a great white Virgin Mary with flowing robe, ballooning partly in the wind and partly tucked in the edges, held aloft by swarms, countless swarms of grave bluebirds with white downy bellies and necks. On the breast a crucifix of gold, in the hand a rosary of gold, on the head a star of gold, beauteous beyond bounds and belief, like snow. She speaks to Gerard. Well, my goodness, T. Gerard, we've been looking for you all morning. So the Virgin Mary's asking Gerard, where have you been? And then he goes on to describe this little wagon that he has, and the lambs are pulling the wagon. The little wagon of snow ascends to heaven. Heaven itself becomes vague. Nizam, with head bent, he's contemplating the perfect ecstasy when Nizam is rudely jolted by Sister Marie, and he wakes to find himself in a classroom with the sad window pole leaning in the corner, and the crosses on the ledges of the blackboards, and the surly marks of woe smudged thereon. So the sister is astonished at this. Roger talked to that very nun. I mean, the nuns back in the they at one point they were the longest living female community members in the United States. They did. You could never tell how old or young. Well, some we could, because we knew that one nun was teaching it for like 35 years. And one of the big events in the summer for us in the Catholic schools was, you know, please dear God, because we had 2 classes of each grade, 2 thirds, 2 fourths, 5ths, to say, please don't let us get Sister Gerard, because she's a mean old bitch or something like that, you know. So Roger actually spoke with this nun, who said, yes, indeed, that actually happened. It was in this room here, and she had prodded him, and he tells her this story. So this that's, and for a while I'm not sure people actually knew that was true, because we're not, you know, we find out, well, there's some embellishments going, that's why they're called novels, but they're based upon actual people and events. So I think that's rather, I think that's wonderful, because we were able to get into these places when Roger was doing a lot of these tours. So we know, and having been with him when this was going on, I've always feel fairly confident saying, well, I can say that this is the room. Oh, sorry.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good.
Have a nice day.
Peace and Jack Carrick.
So that's, apparently that actually happened. This is where this kind of this conflict became, if there really wasn't a real one, between Jack and his brother, because this is Saintly Gerard, and he's only, you know, 7, 8, 9 years of age, and we go over the house here and so on. I mean, the nuns, this was the convent. This is also famously that passages where one of the nuns looks out and sees, you know, this kind of this bum sitting over there. But this was the school building. Is the Green Hall School. That's a new building. That's not the original that Jack was talking about. And of course, the reference Jack is saying that was me.
Yeah.
That she's talking about.
And in fact, right now, a hobo from Louisiana in the East Texas oil fields who happens to be passing through Lowell lies in the straw grass below the Green Street school fence. Right over there, guys. Knee on knee, grass in mouth. So he's laying back. He's got his knees crossed. Okay, he's looking, contemplating the flawless void and humming the blues. And what could be the thoughts of the old nun at the window watching him? Lazy bum, robber, sinner. Okay, well, when Kerouac used to come back to Lowell, and he did this in 1954, this is remarkable, it's never been published, but he has a journal from his travels in 1954. He would walk sometimes 15, 20 miles just looping around all the old neighborhoods he visited. So he used to like to sketch and to, kind of, observe. So he's over there one day and doing that, and he caught sight of a nun in the window kind of looking at him, and he imagines in his head, she's thinking, look at this bum over here, And by the way, the reference to a hobo from the East Texas oil fields, I mean, that's a real person Jack knew named Billy Holmes Hubbard, who he met and talked about and on the road. But so he kind of envisions himself as that kind of character. And what good could he possibly be doing? And he's also in enemy territory. That's the Green Public School. You remember the passage this morning? That's where the kids go to school. They had the tails under their trousers, went to school. What is he doing over there, right? Not knowing, of course, that this guy attended this very, very school here.
Nuns never said that to me about my Baptist friends and so forth. They thought those kids had. I never heard that from them. They had a little bit more sense in saying things like that and so on. But that's.
Hey, Bill, though,
that Gerard had to pass to get to school. Right down here you got Old U Street. Okay, that's the street that Kerouac lived on, so he had to walk right by here. Now, I was a little ignorant at the time when I first came to Lowell, and I did one of these tours with Roger one time. I had my New York Yankees t-shirt on.
Oh.
It wasn't intentional, it wasn't trying to inflame, but I walked by this, and there were some people outside, and they're like, hey, where are you from? I was like, New York? I had to say, New York. And I didn't say it with a lot of emphasis, there was a lot of heat. I was like, oh, okay, thank you.
So here's 34. They lived here, the family, from 1925 to 1927. During the time spent living at 34 Beaulieu Street, the Kerouacs faced a traumatic experience, the death of Jack's older brother by 4 years, Gerard. Gerard died when he was 9 years old of a heart condition started by rheumatic fever. The date of Gerard's death was June 2nd, 1926. The funeral was held here at 34 Beaulieu Street. Most of Jack's novel Visions of Gerard takes place at 34 Beaulieu Street, since it is based on the life and death of Gerard. And this is from Dr. Sachs. On Beaulieu Street, our house was built over an ancient cemetery. Good God, the Yankees and Indians beneath, the World Series of all dry dust. My brother Gerard was of the conviction that the ghosts of the dead beneath the house were responsible for it sometimes rattling and crashing plaster, knocking pickaninny Irish dolls from the shelf. The smell of flowers before somebody dies, the night Gerard died, and all the weeping, yelling, arguing in the bedrooms of the Beaulieu Street house in the brown glooms of Uncle Mike's family, and my mother crying in the yard. The cousins are setting off our firecrackers against our wishes. It's midnight. My father is harassed and worried. So this, Gerard was waked in the house. Back in those days, that was
right here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That was very common. One of my aunts, when she died, I remember going, and the wake was held at her house, and it would be usually in the front room of the parlor. So you can. Jack is here. He's 4. I think his brother was 9 years, 9 months, and 27 days old when he died, and his poor deceased brother is there in the house with him. And no wonder this is, and we've heard too, and it's correct that, and especially with Paul Marion talking about Jack being a spiritual writer, he really is. And the establishment didn't know what to do with a guy like that, saying no one's writing stuff like this. It's at the heart of it. And his French Canadian Roman Catholicism, his Buddhist, delving into Buddhism and so forth. So it's, he's 4, his brothers died, and his friend, Sammy from World War II, he was only 22 years of age. And as we do with the Ghost of Pawtuckaville tour tonight, and where Kurt talks about in depth, and we had that terrific cemetery tour at St. Joseph's, and was able to identify who Pfaff was in the books and so forth, and where they're buried up there. So he's constantly facing this death in his life, and to deal with that, the suffering. In fact, I think that was on. I think that was on the shield of the family crest. Was the last word was suffer, wasn't it? And say, boy, Jack really did. And my thinking is, well, in the way he was kind of medicating himself.
Love, work, suffer.
Yeah, with alcohol.
So,
and
guys, I don't know if you can imagine this. Every time I'm here, I look at this house and I think, well, not only did the Gerard Kerouac die in here, Gerard Kerouac and Jack shared a room. So Jack was bedded in the same room that his brother, and I don't mean to get into too much gruesome detail, his brother died, okay, the result of, he had rheumatic fever, and what rheumatic fever ultimately, however, manifests itself in people, but it manifests itself in Gerard by so weakening the valves in his heart. This little boy died by drowning in his own blood. He bled out internally. Purpura hemorrhagica, it's an awful, awful, awful term. He was in chronic pain for weeks before his death. His body got kind of bloated and swollen. And Jack, although he didn't remember this, his mother reminded him, he says, your little brother would wake up at night, God, why are you doing, I believe in you, I do everything you ask of me, you're hurting me, why are you hurting me? So whether Jack had any conscious recollection of this or not, just imagine hearing stories about that, the suffering, okay? Like Christ on the cross, right? The suffering your little brother or your big brother went through. But that's a reminder to you, even someone as perfect as he was went through that. And then he dies, they take him across the river, prepare him, then they bring him back. And as Phil said, they waked him for 2, possibly 3 days in here. His body in the coffin is in this house. That was common practice at the time, to give all the family members enough time to come there. And Jack, as it's described in Visions of Gerard, tells us when he died, he was happy. He wasn't happy his brother, he was happy. He's like, it's happened. Gerard's finally, he talked about wanting to be in heaven with the birds, right? With the little lambs that were going to pull the wagon, and he was going to build a cottage in heaven for his mother to come and join him. I mean, this house, the birth house, yes, but in some ways this house might be even more important to the unfolding of the life of Jack Kerouac, because he never got over his brother's death. If you listen to that 1962 interview he did on WCAP here with Charles Jarvis, where Jarvis asks, and he talks about Gerard, and he says, I'm not writing these books. He said, Gerard's doing this. Gerard's leading he really felt like he was just, the mortal kind of, agent of his brother doing this writing. And when he mentions Gerard's name, his voice starts breaking. He was in his 40s by then. You figure he processed this, but I think Jack had enormous guilt over having not just outlived his brother, but outlived the better brother in his family. The bum laying in the school, that was how he thought people felt about him. So this house, man, you talk about a whole world of like conflicted, traumatic stuff that happened to the family.
I think it is the most important house
It
in
is.
his life. I
Roger
really
used to
do.
say it was, yeah.
Because this is it. This is the ground springs of all his dealing with suffering and forgiveness, and the nuns would come over here, and the priests would come home that say the rosary, and I'm sure that many of his classmates are coming in here, and you're four. And I don't know how many of us have our first memory. One would say, I remember this at a particular time, because most of us were told, okay, when you were 3 years of age, you did this, you were 4 or 5, and so on. So obviously, Jack was hearing a lot of this from his own family and so on. But the way he captures it and the way he writes about it, is if, he's an eyewitness to these very things himself.
Yes.
Which in a way he really was, because he was physically, he certainly was emotionally present with this was going on, and suffering in his heart as well. So again, this is why his books really are, all of them in one sense, are dealing, maybe not so much town and the city, but dealing with coming to terms with the suffering that all of us that go through. And through this, the uniqueness that every single one of us has to offer, contribute. And not that we're making light of pain and sorrow, it's not that. It's that being able to, the people who, especially when the pandemic was going, that the caregivers and so on, they were real heroes and saints, because of what they were exposing themselves to so much in those times. And that's why I think in many ways that I think he's going to be talked about years from now, Kerouac will, because of books like Visions of Gerard, because it's a universal experience with people. Maybe not because they were waked in someone in their own home, but because of death or the tragedy. And look at that thing, that horrible thing happened in Holyoke, when these 3 dirt balls were shooting, and a woman on a bus got shot, and she lost her 8-month-old baby, and that woman is in the hospital and so on. You say, what? That kind of tragedy. In other words,
what's the
you could
logic?
become very cynical, I think, about life if you say this is what it all is. And I think sometimes Jack experienced it a little bit, but in the end, he didn't. I was mentioned about the famous mouse incident that supposedly happened, where his brother finds a poor mouse in rough shape, tries to heal it, does a little thing, and the cat eats the mouse, and Gerard scolding the cat. I think there was something mentioned when he was at Big Sur, and he was up there in the mountains, and about the mice eating his food, and he didn't want to kill it. And I'm thinking he's probably thinking about if it happened with his brother taking care of this poor mouse and scolding the cat.
Charles Shuttleworth talked about this last year. Guys, if you haven't read Desolation Peak, that new book, the writings about all the writing that Jack did while he was up there, because everybody's like, oh, Jack was just miserable and he was alone and he wanted to go down. Well, yeah, but he wrote almost 100,000 words of prose while he was up there. And one of the things he started writing was Ozone Park, which was this story about how when he was living with his family in Ozone Park, about they had an infestation of mice, and father was just picking them up and throwing them in a bucket and drowning them. And that came to mind for Jack because he killed a mouse in his cabin up there in Desolation Peak. And then he brings it up again when he's in the cabin in Big Sur. Jack was incredibly tender-hearted about animals. And I think it all comes back to that story about, one day your brother bought a mouse home. Around the corner, just a few blocks down, is where Scoop's Market, Dion Brothers Market, used to be one of the places he visited during the cemetery tour. So he brings it home and he creates this perfect little basket, and he gives it food, and he's going to take care of it. And then the cat does what the cat does and eats it. And there's this incredible section where Leo, the father, explains to Gerard the way the world works, and Gerard's like, I don't want anything to do with that. If that's the way the world works, please bring me to heaven right now. I can't deal with this. Now, the most Catholic book that Jack ever wrote, definitely Visions of Gerard. But I said this to people, and I said, you got to think about it this way. The most Buddhist book that Jack ever wrote was Visions of Gerard.
Yeah.
Okay, it's littered with Buddhist terminology, but also a lot of Gerard's wisdom is strongly influenced by, and dig this, guys, 10 Nights in January of 1956. That's how long Jack took to write an entire novel, 10 Nights. He wrote it by candlelight. at his sister's home in Carolina. He had just come from San Francisco, and all of the stuff that you hear about in the opening of the Dharma bumps, right? And he made the cross country. So he had that Buddhist stuff really going through his head. He had that extended kind of, you know, brotherhood with Gary Snyder and all of the San Francisco. So that's in his head when he's writing Visions of Gerard. That's why it's so intensely Buddhist and Catholic. And it's all over that book, but he's like, you know, it's like he's trying to make sense of this thing that he never quite could wrap his head around. Now, the cat and mouse episode, just one little slightly more humorous anecdote. Roger was standing right in the middle of this street one time reading that passage from Visions of Gerard. You know, and he's really doing it justice, and you're like getting caught up in it. And all of a sudden, right from out here, it's like a cat just came walking out into the street about 5 or 6 feet behind Roger, and it just sits there in the road behind it. And Roger didn't know it. Roger had seen, so Roger's reading, we're all looking at Roger and transfixed, and then we're like, the cat, we're going, was this planned? You know, is that like, because you don't have a better sense of dramatic timing than this cat had. So he walked there the whole time, and when Roger was finished reading, we kind of told him, and he turned around and looked at it, and then the cat just continued on its way, just came out perfectly in the middle of this reading. And I was like, okay, I think we just had a mystical experience, but you know, make of it what you will. But it was great. Hello. Oh, you're going in here. Sorry. So there it is, folks. That's Beaulieu Street.
Yeah, that just about wraps up the mystic part of the tour. I think there's some event going on at 12 o'clock.